Our next speaker is Dr. Julian Baggini. Dr. Baggini is the author, co-author, or editor of over 20 books, including, and there are lists of them, The Godless Gospel, How the World Thinks, The Virtues of the Table, and The Ego Trick, all by Granta, and The Edge of Reason by Yale University Press. He was the founding editor of the Philosopher's magazine and has written for numerous newspapers and magazines, as well as for the think tanks, the Institute of Public Policy Research, Demos, and Counterpoint. He is the academic director of the Royal Institute of Philosophy and an honorary research fellow at the University of Kent. And his website, maybe we can put his website in the chat. It's basically his name, julianbaggini.com. Today, what Julian will be exploring with us is the Godless Gospel, Jesus as a Moral Philosopher. Thank you, Julian.
Thanks very much indeed. I'm assuming I'm allowed to skip. Yes, I can share screen. Thanks very much indeed. So thanks for having me. Shame I can't actually be in Newcastle, but this is second best. So yeah, I wanted to talk about, well, not give you a summary of my new book, but focus on one particular aspect of it, which I think should be of interest to a philosophically minded audience, which is this. The book was really asking the question whether Jesus was a great moral teacher, because it's kind of assumed that he is. He's often, people who are not Christians, who are not even religious, repeatedly say words to the effect that I don't believe Jesus was the Son of God, I don't believe he rose from the dead, I don't believe he cured the sick, but I do believe he was a great moral teacher. And even Richard Dawkins has said such a thing. And it's a commonplace, and most people sort of nod and accept it. But, you know, hearing this for about 50 years more, it began to sort of grate on me, because I thought that, well, when people say that, what do they mean? If I was to say, well, how is he a great moral teacher? Most people, I think, would struggle to come up with much in response to that of any substance. Let's say he teaches forgiveness and do unto others as you do yourself. But then you could point out that these are hardly unique or special moral teachings, and nor do they add up to any kind of coherent moral philosophy. So yes, he believed some things we might approve of, but does that make him a great moral teacher? So I wanted to look a bit more closely at this. But I suppose the question not in the subtitle of the book, but the question I want to talk about today, is not whether he was a great moral teacher, but whether we can consider him to be a moral philosopher. Now, you may remember George W. Bush being asked once who his favorite philosopher was, and his reply was Jesus Christ. And people took that reply not to be an interesting answer, good thoughtful point. They took it just to simply indicate the fact that Bush knew nothing about philosophy. So the idea that Jesus is and should be considered an important moral philosopher is something that I think actually is widely ridiculed. I don't think many people really believe it. Well, why not? What's wrong with the idea? Well, let's think, what does a moral philosopher look like? Well, here are two examples of what they literally have looked like. Unfortunately, they have historically, if you're talking about philosophy in the Western tradition, they have generally been white and male, like Jeremy Bentham, and that's his auto icon with his skeletal frame and a waxwork head at University College London, and David Hume to the right. But I don't mean what do they look like physically. I mean, what characterizes a moral philosopher? And I think that, again, in the Western tradition, there are certain characteristics we would expect a moral philosopher to have. And this is the three I'd sum them up. The first one is they offer arguments. That seems to be absolutely critical to someone being a moral philosopher, rather than, shall we say, just a moral teacher. A moral teacher may say, do this, do that, and so forth. And what they tell us to do may well be good. There may be nothing to object to in that. But they seem to, surely they're only philosophers if they offer some arguments in support of what they are proposing. So that seems to be important. And the second point would be that they proceed systematically. So, in offering, you could say this is part of offering arguments, but you proceed ABC, and you sort of give a thorough overview, and you end up with a system. You present a system. That's what you get at the end. So Jeremy Bentham was a moral philosopher because he gave us a utilitarianism. He gave us arguments for it. He systematically set out how it should work, and the result was an entire framework for looking at your moral philosophy. And Hume, in his view, which is basically the idea that, well, it's now called versions, things like emotivism, but the idea that morality is essentially rooted in human sympathy and not in any abstract principles, and again, goes on to set out the implications of that. So that's what a moral philosopher looks like. Now, if you then look at what we have from the life and teachings of Jesus, then it seems that we just don't have these things. And that's why Jesus is not considered a moral philosopher. We don't get arguments, we get parables, and we get instructions. These don't add up to arguments. There's no systematicity. The Gospels tell a life story, essentially. And by the way, of course, remember, the Gospels are the only source we have for the moral teachings of Jesus. You could say that the epistles and the Acts of the Apostles give some kind of second-hand sort of version of that, but really the only texts in which we have Jesus's supposed own words are the Gospels. There's no systematic proceeding there. It's just a life story. Events happen. The framework of the Gospels isn't the unfolding of an argument, it's the unfolding of a life. And in the end, there doesn't seem to be any kind of system either. And this is interesting to me because when I was writing the book, one of the things I did was I met with several Christian philosophers and theologians because, you know, I wanted to check that what I was saying about Jesus wasn't completely ridiculous. That, you know, people who knew their Bible studies wouldn't simply say that's absurd. And I also wanted to sort of test out some of my conclusions with them. And what struck me was that they all said that they didn't think that Jesus was setting out a complete moral system. That's just not what he was doing. One of the reasons for that, they said, was that Jesus took for granted a certain framework. He was a Jew, he came from that tradition. Often when he was asked what you should do, how you should behave, he pointed people towards the law. He said, you know what the law says, follow the law. So he has this kind of framework, and what he was doing, and this again is not my view, but it's really the view of the Christian thinkers and philosophers I spoke to, what he was doing was, in a sense, providing certain supplements and challenges and sort of revisions, as it were, and interpretations of the law. It doesn't add up to a whole system at all. And you'd struggle to find one there. So the idea of seeing Jesus as a moral philosopher would seem then to be doomed from the get-go. But I'm not so sure. I'm not so sure about this. And I think the reason is not because Jesus actually can tick off this checklist. It's rather, I'm not actually convinced this checklist is a very good checklist of what makes someone a moral philosopher. So let's take a few things first. Let's start with the idea of proceeding systematically. Well, Confucius is generally regarded as a moral philosopher. Pretty much all but the most outrageous chauvinist would acknowledge that. But in the Analects, and also in the works such as the Mencius of his followers, which are part of the Confucian canon, we don't get any sort of systematic, any kind of systematic way of proceeding at all. What we get are fragments, sometimes very short fragments, sometimes just a single phrase, sometimes a slightly longer story, but there is no systematicity in the presentation whatsoever. But still, Confucius is considered a moral philosopher. And why is that? Well, because this method he has still provides sort of insight, challenge, new ways of thinking, which there are reasons for them. I think that is what's quite interesting to me in general about, we'll come back to this in terms of argumentation later maybe, but I think that what really characterizes the philosophical enterprise, it doesn't uniquely distinguish it, but one of its key characteristics is his use of reason, and the use of reason is essentially about reason giving. So what makes the difference between a philosophical argument, and just telling you what to believe, is that I give you reasons to believe. And those reasons are often in the form of arguments, but they're not only in the form of arguments, actually. But I'll tell you what, I'll come back to this later, because we've got a section on arguments coming up. But yeah, so if someone has to proceed systematically in order to count moral philosophy, you're going to have to discount people like Confucius and Mencius. Even in the Western tradition, you may well have to discount some works by Nietzsche. Some of Nietzsche's works are very systematic and follow an argument through. Others are aphoristic, and Schopenhauer also wrote aphorisms. You might even say that Aristotle, actually, the ethics of Aristotle are a collection of lecture notes, and they're a bit of a mess, really. I think you can see a certain order and systematicity there, so it's not that it lacks any order. But this just seems to be too strong a task. If someone's got interesting and important things to say about the nature of morality or how we should act morally, then the fact that they don't proceed systematically should not rule them out. What about the idea that nevertheless you offer a system? Confucius didn't, the Confucian texts we have aren't systematic treatises, but there is something we can recognizably identify as Confucianism. And that means it gives us a conception of what the good life is, what the summum bonum, the ultimate good that we're heading towards, which in his case was a flourishing society, I believe, harmonious and flourishing society. It gives us sort of principles for determining what the appropriate forms of conduct are and ways of trying to distinguish in difficult cases and so forth. It adds up to a system. So isn't that important? Well, those of you who recognize the photograph here can easily see why that's not a good enough answer either. This is Bernard Williams. Now, Bernard Williams, pretty much everyone agrees in the English-speaking world at least, and actually he has a lot of admirers in continental Europe too. But Bernard Williams was considered to be one of the greatest moral philosophers of the second part of the 20th century. And he was a brilliant thinker and a wonderful essayist. He never got close to articulating or presenting a whole system. In fact, he didn't even take positions very often. I had the privilege to interview him. It's turned out to be fairly soon before his death. And he said there were about 2 positions which he was associated with in his career. So he didn't have positions, he didn't present a system. What on earth then made him a moral philosopher? Well, he wrote very insightful, often essays, academic papers, if you like, but they really were, I prefer to call them essays because they have an elegance and a clarity which is more associated historically with the essay form than the academic paper form, which gave us tremendous insights and challenges and ways of thinking about philosophy. So, for example, he had a very powerful challenge against utilitarianism, which is still routinely used today. So just to sort of set this out, utilitarianism is the philosophy that the right action is the one that has the net greatest benefit for everybody. And that benefit can be in different versions of utilitarianism, can be about happiness, it can be about welfare, it can be in maximizing people's interests, it may be maximizing their capacity to make choices, whatever it might be. But the point is this: it's good if it has good consequences, it's bad if it has bad consequences, and it's as simple as that. And each person in this system, to go back to Bentham, should count for one and no more than one. So it's rigorously impartial. Now, Williams criticized it because he said it didn't recognize what he called the separateness of persons. The separateness of persons means that people are not just replaceable, interchangeable units of value. So although it may be true that from an objective point of view, your happiness counts the same amount as my happiness does, you, in this case, is a complete stranger to me. And the idea that your happiness should count the same to me as the happiness of those closest to me and those I love is, a lot of people say, is actually barbaric, is inhumane, to not allow people to care more about some people than others is to ask them to give up their humanity and become abstract, sort of moral calculating machines. He put this argument obviously in greater length, in more detail than me, but you can see this is an important, useful piece of moral philosophy. It's not a system. In fact, it's not only not a system, it's having a go at a system. So if you start before Bernard Williams, you at least have one system there, which is utilitarianism. Afterwards, if you agree with him, you're left with none, because all he's done is brought it down and hasn't put anything in its place. But that's fine. He's doing moral philosophy clearly, so no problem there. So if you're not offering a system, not seeing systematic, what are you doing? Well, I mean, I gave an example there, really. Critique is one thing. Bernard Williams was doing critique of lots of moral theories. And Jesus was doing that too, I think. And in particular, we might also say providing moral challenges. So let's give one example here. And we'll see here how this isn't about building a system, and it's not also about proceeding systematically, but there's something valuable going on here. So you may, if you know your Bible, your Gospels, you may recognize what this scene is. A rich young man goes to Jesus and asks him what he has to do to be saved. And Jesus' first answer is, as it often is, well, you know the law, love thy mother and father, etc., etc. And he goes, yes, indeed. He goes, right, so there's one more thing you need to do. Give up all your wealth and follow me. And the rich man thinks, I'll go and think about it. And he doesn't say that. He just basically goes off and doesn't do it. Now, I mean, this is a little story, and I haven't given any detail here, but if you look over the various different things that Jesus says and does over his mission, as Christians would call it, then he repeatedly does have this challenge to people to reject their attachment to material wealth. And I think that although in isolation, you don't see clear arguments for any kind of system at work in any particular point, when you put it all together, you do see sort of like there are reasons given for this. I think there's something kind of compelling there. And the essential idea here is that wealth essentially detracts us from what is most important. What is most important is becoming the best versions of ourselves. So when Jesus says that you cannot serve both God and mammon, the same kind of principle can apply even if you're godless. You cannot serve the good and mammon. And I think we recognize this, that when we have material things, we become attached to them, they become too important to us, and they can very easily detract us from what's most important in life. Now, I mean, I'm just giving an outline of this here, but that kind of challenge to our material values and questioning whether or not we're right to do that, and thinking that maybe we need to give them up. This is an important and worthwhile moral challenge, something that can shake us up. So, for example, myself, I would say, if you ask me which moral philosophers do I follow most closely, I would say Aristotle and Hume. And Aristotle perhaps more so in a way because he has more of a kind of a framework, the virtue ethics framework of the importance of character and so forth. But there's no doubt about it, if you look at Aristotle's ethics, it's an ethics of human flourishing. That's the ultimate goal, that we should flourish. In his time, it was an ethic for the aristocracy, for the most powerful and the richest. It wasn't an ethic for the ordinary person in the street. In fact, in the Athens of his time, for every free Athenian, I think there were about 3 slaves, maybe. And clearly he wasn't writing his ethics for them. Today, we tend to have a more democratic version. If you are Aristotelian, you have a more democratic version in the sense that one seeks the flourishing of as many people as possible. Doesn't for 1 minute think that it should be the flourishing only of a elite. Nonetheless, I think that in a world in which there is still so much abject poverty, so much real suffering, there is something potentially self-indulgent and selfish about following sort of an Aristotelian system without anything else to supplement it. And the value you get as an Aristotelian or as a Humean, maybe others too, by reading Jesus and listening to his challenge, is that it's that reminder that, you know, the world is full of poverty and suffering. And I think that sort of counterbalance. And so it's the idea here that overall, Aristotle may well offer us the best vision framework for philosophy, but that doesn't mean that we still don't need certain challenges, philosophical challenges to that, in order for us to stop slipping into that kind of aristocratic complacency, which Aristotle himself and many people of his time arguably did slip into. I want to now turn to this idea of arguments, because I think this is perhaps the core of it. If you're going to argue that Jesus was a moral philosopher, and yet he didn't seem to offer arguments, then you are in trouble. Now, what I want to suggest here is that it's something of the self-image of philosophy, analytic philosophy in particular, Western philosophy in general, is that that's what it does. It provides arguments. And yet the sort of embarrassing, dirty secret of moral philosophy in particular is that actually at the basis of so much moral philosophy, you don't find any kind of argument at all. So let me give an example. This is one of the most famous papers in late 20th century moral philosophy. Peter Singer's, and I'll get the name slightly wrong, Famine, Poverty and Affluence or something. And he begins this paper with a very simple thought experiment. You're walking by a pond, and in this pond, a child is drowning. The pond is too deep for the child, but it's not so deep for you. You can wade in, you don't even have to be able to swim. You can wade in and you can pull the child out. And it's perfectly within your abilities to do that. The only price you'll pay is that you are going to ruin your brand new suit and you're going to be late for a business meeting now. So what do? Now, anyone who's not a complete monster says, well, you wade in and pull the child out. If you know anyone who says, I'm not going to ruin my suit for that, then you need to reconsider your friendships. And so Singer, the point about the thought experiment is that that's obviously true, right? It's so obviously true that we don't need to say any more. And then the argument is actually following through on the consequences of that. So Singer says that what this argument establishes essentially is a general principle, which is that if we can bring about significant good for others, in particularly good which saves lives and eliminates suffering, at a cost to ourselves which is much less, then we ought to do it. And if you agree with this principle at this point, where he's now got you hooked and he will reel you in, because he's going to argue that the consequence of that is actually the recognition that, as a matter of fact, so much of what we do in life is unnecessary. We could be using our time and resources to save lives, and instead we choose not to. We buy cappuccinos that cost like £2.80, when that's kind of, a worm treatment which will make someone well for maybe the rest of their life, whatever it might be, and let alone greater extravagances. So the argument he ends up with is that we all have this duty. If you agree that the person passing the pond has a duty to go in and save the child in the pond, then the logical consequence of that is that we have a duty to live much more simply and to give away a lot more of our wealth to help save lives, at least until such a point as there is sufficient equality in the world that it is not required of me to do that. Now, that's an archetypal kind of moral argument in the modern Western tradition. But is it really at its heart an argument at all? I mean, what it starts off with is a situation, and it asks you for your response. There is no argument for the response. If you say, I would walk by, I think the person should walk by, it's not their fault the child is in the pond. Parents should have been looking after the child better. And I shouldn't get my suit dirty, I shouldn't be late. There's no real argument against that, except to say, well, you're a monster, you're inhumane, you're cruel. That's not an argument. That's not an argument. That's and the point is, it's not really meant to be an argument. The whole point of the example is that the intuition is supposed to be so clear and strong that it doesn't require any argumentative support. And a lot of moral philosophy is like that. A lot of moral philosophy begins with a thought experiment or a hypothetical situation. It's eliciting an intuition. That's what it's ultimately doing. And the argument part only comes later. It comes in the drawing out of the conclusions from the intuition. But in a way, often a lot of the work's done by the intuition itself. Now, and by the way, I think I'll make a more general point here because we have time to do this. In moral philosophy, I think this is very clear. In a lot of philosophy, in more philosophy than we might like to acknowledge, I think that you similarly find the core of a so-called argument is not an argument. The core of the argument is an observation or an intuition. And I can give two examples of that, actually, which are, again, absolutely mainstream, canonical philosophy 101 things. The first one's Descartes' argument for the eternal, indivisible, immortal soul. How does that begin? Well, it begins with the fact that Descartes sets about trying to doubt everything that could be doubted and finds there's one thing he cannot doubt, and that is that I am, I exist. The cogito ergo sum, I think, therefore I am formulation is found in another way. I think it's found in the Discourse on Method. It's not found in the Meditations. In the Meditations, there's not even a therefore in the formulation. And that's kind of more honest, because what he's really saying is that you don't argue your way to the conclusion that the self cannot be doubted. You notice, you observe that it cannot be doubted. You try to doubt it, you can't do it. So it's actually kind of an empirical observation and not an argument that you cannot doubt the existence of the self. Again, what he tries to argue from this is something else, and then arguments come in. They're not very good arguments in my view. Maybe we can talk about that later. But the core of it is not an argument. Now, David Hume disagreed with Descartes. He didn't phrase his passage when he wrote about the self, naming Descartes by name, but clearly Descartes and people like him were in his targets. He basically said, well, again, he didn't try and come up with a counter argument. He came up with a counter observation. When I enter most intimately into what I call myself, he said, when I introspect, I do not find an indivisible self at all. In fact, I don't find any self at all. What I find are particular thoughts, particular feelings, particular sensations, particular ideas, and so forth. And you can try this at home, folks, as a little experiment. Next time you've got a spare few minutes, just sort of shut your eyes, or don't even shut your eyes. Try and observe yourself. Try and observe the thing which is perceiving. And I think he was right. What you'll actually discover is that all that you are aware of are a kind of sequence of particular experiences. You'll notice the itch on your foot, or the ache in your calf. You'll notice the sort of the greyness of the sky as I'm looking out the window here, and so forth. It's one sensation after another that you don't find a self. Now, again, a bit of a digression. Descartes and Hume and the self is not the theme of the talk, but you can see my point here, that even there, these canonical core themes and subjects in philosophy, argument isn't actually at the heart of it, observation is, and also maybe intuition. So what does that tell us about Jesus then? Well, I think Jesus's parables essentially work in a remarkably similar way. I say parables, also some of the stories. Some of the stories of Jesus's life and teachings and actions kind of work in the similar kind of way as parables. So with a parable, a story is presented, the point here with the story is that it's up to you to kind of like, to have an intuitive or observational response to it. And then the general point is something that you then work out yourself. So that's where the reasoning comes in. So if we take the Good Samaritan, this is one of those famous ones. So most people know this one, so forgive me if I go through a bit briefly, but I can't assume everybody knows it. So the story of the Good Samaritan is that there is, and it's a parable, it's just a fictional story, a man is sort of attacked and beaten and left for dead by robbers by the side of the road. And then I think it's a Pharisee comes, basically some kind of religious cleric comes by, sees the man, walks on. Someone else comes along who's a sort of more junior cleric, and again he walks by. And then the Samaritan, who is not one of the people, one of the sort of the chosen people, not a Jew, from another land, passes by, and he takes the man to be looked after. He pays for him to have a bed and to be looked after. And this story is told because Jesus is asked, who is my neighbor? Because the commandment is love thy neighbor, and he's asked, who is my neighbor? So Jesus tells this story and then asks, so which of these do you think is the neighbor? And the answer is the Samaritan. And I mean, it's one of the simpler parables of Jesus, but you can see how it functions in a very similar way, actually, to a contemporary argument in moral philosophy, in that a kind of hypothetical scenario is presented in which the interpretation is taken to be so self-evident that it doesn't require any further argument. Of course, the neighbor is the person who helps, and so in other words, being a neighbor isn't a matter of your tribe, it isn't a matter of your position or your official relation. Being a neighbor is a matter of how you treat your fellow humans, irrespective of whether they are of your tribe or of your group. That's the general conclusion which you generate for yourself. Jesus doesn't ever say that. You work it out for yourself. And I think that's another interesting point as well, because in contemporary philosophy, part of the methodology is that the philosopher will draw out every single conclusion to the tiniest detail. And that kind of makes sense in a tradition where the historical purpose has become as much about making the rational case and articulating a full system. That's kind of part of the idea of what philosophy is. Now, in traditions and times where the main function of moral philosophy was actually to help us to live better, which I think is the main purpose of moral philosophy in classical Confucian ethics, Taoist ethics, I think also in lots of ancient Greek ethics, to be honest. If the purpose is to help us to live better, then it can sometimes be, if not always, it can sometimes be better if the person doing the teaching doesn't spell everything out for themselves. It's a very nice line in the Confucian Analects where Confucius says, if I show a student one corner of the square and they cannot, or maybe it's one corner of the triangle, and they cannot work out the other two for themselves, then I cannot help him. Words to that effect. So the idea here is that until the student is able to join the dots themselves, to be able to work out the implications of what's being taught for themselves, then they're not yet ready, and you can't really teach them. And they can't be taught. They're beyond being taught in that way. And I think that's kind of true. So in Jesus as a moral teacher, and even as a moral philosopher, his goal is not to articulate for himself every single aspect of what it is he's teaching, is to tell us enough so that we can then go out and work things out for ourselves. And by the way, he's also very clear that most people can't do that. He repeatedly says that his message is too hard for people, and other people aren't able to do it. And the point of telling parables is not actually to make things simple, it was actually to make them hidden in a way. So which is an interesting inversion of what we normally take them to be. And again, so that was a parable here. This painting here actually is a different story. This isn't a parable, but it works like a parable. It's a story of the woman taken in adultery. That's a traditional name of the story, even though taken in adultery sounds like an odd phrase today. So here what happens is that a woman was caught in adultery. She was taken to Jesus. Notice the man was not. Plus ça change. And they challenge him. They're trying to trap him, basically, saying, should we stone her to death, as is the law of Moses? Because they kind of know Jesus isn't into this kind of violent retribution thing, but they don't want him to. So they suspect he won't do that, but so they want him to admit that he's going against the law of Moses. Then they've got something against him. Jesus, very interestingly, this is Jesus sort of kneeling down here. He doesn't respond to them immediately. He just draws in the sand, thinking away. And then he says, he who is without sin shall cast the first stone. And then everybody, one by one, goes away because people recognize that they are not without sin, so they can't then cast the first stone. So look, that's an interesting story. So again, what happens here? There is no explicit articulation of an argument by him, but he's doing, again, the typical thing that is done in any kind of moral philosophy, many moral philosophy arguments today, which is he presents us with a situation in which the appropriate response is almost like self-evident, so it doesn't require argument. And this is part of a broader set of teachings about non-judgment, not judging others, focusing on your own virtue above all else. And I think this has as much kind of cogency as a paper you might find in a contemporary journal. There is one more thing that we should say about moral teaching and the teaching of ethics. I talked about argument and proceeding systematically and offering a system as archetypal things done in philosophy. But there's an important aspect of moral teaching which isn't central today in moral philosophy, but it was certainly there in ancient Greece, and it was absolutely there in Confucian philosophy in particular. And this is the idea of providing an example. So the idea here is, again, that if moral teaching is essentially a practical matter, it's not a theoretical matter. I mean, in contemporary moral philosophy, we do get very caught up in what are almost entirely theoretical questions about the nature of the good, or whether or not moral values have an objective existence and so forth. These questions have their place. But historically, the central purpose of moral philosophy has been helping us to live better, to make better choices. And in lots of traditions, it's understood that one of the most powerful ways of doing that is by providing an example, by being an example yourself. Aristotle recognized this. He said a sort of training in virtue may result from associating with good people, because he thought that being good was a matter of cultivating the right kind of habits. He thought it was very important, therefore, who you hang around with, because if you hang around with the wrong people, you're just going to get drawn into sort of bad behaviors and sort of petty lies, petty deceptions, and this will shape your character for the worse. On the other hand, if you hang around with good people, then that sort of goodness will rub off. Confucius certainly was very, very strong on this idea of exemplarism, being an exemplar. He particularly talked about this in terms of a ruler. Again, one famous passage, he says that if the ruler is good, then the people, as it were, sort of follow his, again, it's his in Confucian's time, his lead as the grass bows with the wind. So just as the wind blows over the grass and the grass moves, and there's no great exertion is required for that to happen, when a leader exhibits virtue and goodness, then people are just more inclined to follow. It might sound a little bit romantic, a little bit sort of particularly in an age of people like Donald Trump. But I think there is something in that. But certainly it's also the case, I think, that when it comes to doing well, being good, the power of example is extremely important, actually. And I think that if you ask most people, perhaps, what was it? People who you admire for their moral virtue, some people are persuaded by arguments. There are a few of them, but I think a lot of other people are more persuaded by example. They see what living a good life means in people who are good at it, and they follow. And I think that's what Jesus again was trying to do. And that's why you get stories. That's why the presentation of the ideas in the Gospels as a story of a life is not anti-philosophical, because you get to see a life to be modeled. I have to say, cut to the chase here, although I find a lot that is useful and interesting in it, I don't ultimately want to follow the model completely. I'm not entirely persuaded of it, but nonetheless, providing the character as the model seems to be a very appropriate way to go forward. So I'm going to pretty much wrap up there, so we've got plenty of time for questions and discussion. So just to sort of conclude, if should we take Jesus seriously as a moral philosopher? I think as a philosopher, specifically as a philosopher rather than as a moral teacher, I think you certainly get less in the Gospels than you do in the greatest works of moral philosophy. So I'm not saying, let's shake up the curriculum so that the Gospel of St. Matthew is taught alongside the Nicomachean Ethics, or the groundwork for the metaphysics of morals by Kant. I don't think that, but I do think that the idea that Jesus simply can be discounted as a moral philosopher says a lot about the kind of prejudices and false self-images that philosophy has of itself. So in a way, perhaps the upshot of this, from a moral philosophy point of view, the most interesting upshot, I hope, of this talk is not that we should all rush out and pay a lot more attention to Jesus, although that may not be a bad thing. It's rather that we use this sort of reflection as an opportunity to think a bit more about what it is we're doing when we're doing moral philosophy, and to recognize that the offering of arguments and the development of systems and the systematic way of proceeding are actually, they're not only not always necessary, they're not only important, they're simply, they don't accurately describe a lot of what moral philosophy actually is. So I'll stop there with my sort of like trailer there. That's the book cover, available from all good booksellers and bad ones too, but you can avoid the bad ones these days. And if I'm actually just while we're here, while talking about by example and modelling, etc., moral instruction, there is now a very, very good alternative and there have been alternatives to Amazon, of course, for ages, but one of the best ones is Bookshop UK, or bookshop.org UK, where you buy books and taxes are paid and booksellers receive a share of it, independent booksellers. So that's that. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Julian, for that fascinating presentation and those persuasive arguments indeed. We are waiting for questions to come in. Okay, okay, right. We have one question, the initial one. Okay. So you were talking about being more flexible with our definitions of the types of philosophy. Do you see this flexibility being of use with other types of philosophy rather than just moral philosophy? If so, can you give examples, please?
Can you repeat that for me? I'm not sure I quite got it, sorry.
Yay, sorry. Hannes, would you like to clarify?
You to just be asking awkward questions all day.
Indeed,
maybe I should just stop.
No, go ahead.
I just meant that you, I found your paper really interesting because as you were sort of explaining kind of how we might approach Jesus as a moral philosopher, you were talking a lot about sort of expanding and becoming more flexible with our understanding of even what a moral philosopher is in the first place. And this is something that I've come across myself in kind of other schools of philosophy, is that you sometimes have these very rigid definitions of like, this is what political philosophy is, those kind of things, you know, this is what metaphysics is. And I was just wondering if you're open to other schools of philosophy kind of having the flexibility you're talking about here, and perhaps key examples just for you and your thought. That's all. It's just to try and I don't know, understand where you're coming from. But it was a fascinating paper. Thank you so much.
No, thank you. I mean, just to clarify, when you say schools, I mean, do you mean sort of the sort of subdivisions like ethics and political philosophy and metaphysics?
Yes, of course. Okay, right. Sorry.
Yeah, no, that's fine. That's fine. It's one of those ambiguous terms. Yeah, so it was something like school as in the Aristotelian or whatever. Yeah, no, I think generally speaking, I think a certain kind of a methodological what we call it, Catholicism and openness is to be a good thing. I think that philosophy in the English-speaking world, I don't want to overgeneralize or come up to so much, but listen, when I started doing philosophy, this was like 1987, and there was to go back in time, there wasn't public philosophy really didn't even exist. It had become a very academic discipline, but also the discipline had become very professionalized. And I think that there was a kind of, and no one was writing stuff on things like the meaning of life was like, I would say, almost like a taboo topic. As a professional philosopher, you would not utter the terms meaning of life. In a sense, if someone asked you, oh, you're a philosopher, what's the meaning of life then? That was proof that they were ignorant and didn't understand what philosophy was about. And I think it was a kind of an overreaction. I think, you know, philosophy has a certain, suffers from a certain sort of science envy and things like that. You know, there's always that sort of fear that what we're doing is BS and is like nonsense and is empty and spinning in the wind. And so there was this huge thing to kind of show, no, philosophy is a proper, rigorous academic subject. And that meant we're very keen on sort of like developing its own methods, its own canon, and kind of defining itself clearly as this respectable discipline separated from others. But I think that was in a way, I mean, it's understandable, but I think it's a historical betrayal, because historically philosophy is, well, historically, of course, everything was philosophy. You know, subjects only became separated from philosophy as they developed their own separate methods. But even philosophy, what we recognise anachronistically as philosophy, was always contiguous with and in dialogue with other disciplines. So if you read David Hume today, you know, Hume was also a psychologist. He was a historian as well, and not a very good anthropologist. That's one of the things he wasn't good at. So I think that generally speaking, although people pull in two directions, having very clear methods and ways of doing things and developing those very thoroughly is a way of introducing a certain rigor to your discipline. That is true. But I think that comes at too high a cost if it cuts yourself off from other things. And doesn't mean anything goes, but it does mean we should be more open, for sure, I think, yeah.
Okay, Hannes, if you have any further thoughts on that, please put it in the Q&A. Thank you very much. So we have a question from John, and he does say that he's talking about referring to Eastern and Western in simplistic terms and definitions. But he goes on to say, or rather he begins by saying that he agrees in principle with much of what you've said, but are we talking specifically about how Western's philosophy sees itself regarding argumentation, systematization, etc.? Would Eastern philosophical traditions see Jesus as a moral philosopher?
Yeah, I mean, I think I did when in the talk, I did use the phrase sort of Western philosophy to sort of clarify what I was talking about. I think that's true. Now, if you look at sort of beyond the West, and again, you're right to kind of wave the flag, the warning flag for making simplistic distinctions, and I think that a lot of non-Western philosophy has a lot in common with Western philosophy, and that's why, you know, Western philosophers should be interested with it. It's not entirely exotic. On the other hand, it does have different ways of doing things, and that's another reason to pay attention to it. I think it's true that it depends what sort of tradition you're talking about as well. I mean, in the Indian tradition, I mean, there are lots of there's a sort of standard ways of distinguishing between different schools of classical Indian philosophy, and the orthodox, so-called orthodox schools, all kind of take the Vedas, the ancient Vedas, as having some kind of sacred status, some kind of thing. And so philosophy in that tradition is always seen, it's always presented as commentary on those ancient texts. So it's seen as interpretation and commentary, never as something completely original ex nihilo, as it were. And in that tradition, absolutely, you know, in the same way Jesus was a commentator and interpreter of his religious tradition, bringing intellectual challenge to it. So I think that would entirely be seen to be correct. And also, you know, the whole distinction between religion and philosophy wouldn't be clear there. If you go to China, I think China's a bit different. Roger Ames and a colleague of his, and I'm very bad with names full stop, and because this is a pair of people, I'm constantly doing down his collaborator by not remembering the name. They came up with this distinction, which is fine, between what they called truth-seeking and way-seeking in philosophy. Now, this is not a binary distinction between way seekers and truth. It's like saying that philosophy has, in all its manifestations, two kind of core missions, if you like. One is truth-seeking, to know how things are, simple as that. And the other is way-seeking, to know, to find out how we should navigate through life, how we should live. And all traditions have both. But their contention is that in some traditions, the way-seeking is to the fore, and to others, the truth-seeking is to the fore. And that changes over time. So on their view, in the Western tradition, in ancient Greece, way-seeking was still the primary thing. There was truth-seeking, but way-seeking, yeah. If you did philosophy, it was understood that your primary task was to find out how to live. But the Western tradition has sort of become more focused on the truth-seeking aspect. And I think they'd say that in China, in particular, way-seeking has sort of always been the most dominant thing, and it's remained that, and that therefore, and so the practicality of it, and again the fact that the moral teaching is seen to be done by example, and you're meant to work things out for yourself. I think then, you know, Jesus would also be more recognised as a philosopher. What I don't know, though, in your question is, would they see him as a moral philosopher? I don't know whether they'd think he was much good at it. That I don't know.
So similarly, for instance, with the Buddha or the Buddhist teachings, could the Buddha be regarded as a moral philosopher?
By me or by
you? Yes, by you. Similar to Jesus.
Yeah. Well, no, I think again that's a very difficult one as well, because in terms of sources, the sources are even more remote. I mean, we don't have original words of Jesus. We have even less original words of the Buddha. But certainly, and again, I have to caveat this. Most of my knowledge here is very much secondhand, but they're good second hands. Obviously, particularly, I think in the Pali canon in particular, I think. Oh no, and also in later traditions. So the early Pali canon is the closest we get to what may or may not be the Buddha's words. There's a lot of philosophy in there, not just about moral philosophy, but nature of the self. You know, the Buddhist theory of the self is very, very interesting, and anticipates. No, it doesn't anticipate. You know, Hume had a very, very similar view, and again, in lots of the middle way Buddhism. There's a lot of philosophy in that too. But I think that's quite interesting. It tends to be that's the easiest one for people to recognize, I think. Most people who've spent any time reading Buddhism will recognize that it's got philosophically interesting things in it. Mm-hmm. Yeah.
As opposed to Jesus. Lovely. Okay, so we come to the next question from Franco. Do you think morals by example approach could work if the examples are chosen to cover all the relevant use cases examined by a more argumentative moral philosophy. Would you recommend it in that case?
Could we ask Franco to expand on that?
Okay, Franco, can you please can you expand on that? About the use case. Okay, we'll get back to Franco.
I could invite him to talk.
Please,
Yeah, invite him to talk.
thank you.
Yeah, invite him to talk. Let's take advantage of that capacity.
Excellent.
Hello, thank you
Franco,
for gifting me voice, and thanks for the talk. The question was, I mean, of course, in analyzing what's a moral philosophy and a moral philosopher, you basically discuss different ways of, doing moral philosophy, different kinds of things we call moral philosophy. I was wondering if you would consider a good way of doing moral philosophy, of presenting it, by doing it by example, if the examples are picked based on a more Western argumentative kind of moral philosophy. So let's say you have like an architectural approach, such as, I don't know, you mentioned Kant, you mentioned Aristotle, and would you say it could be a good way to present them by picking examples rather than by trying to teach people the whole architectural theory?
Yeah, it's an interesting question, isn't it? It's such an unfamiliar way of doing things that it can be hard to imagine what that could mean. I think that I actually think you're right. I'm just trying to think how one would do it and what it would mean. I think that, in a sense, what's the real test of whether a moral philosophy is any good? And I think, in a way, the test is how people who follow it properly behave, right? So, and I think so. For example, anyone who was tempted to believe in the early 1930s that National Socialism was a emboldening, sort of dignifying boost to the human spirit would, you don't need an argument against that when you see what following that philosophy leads to. Similarly, I think that, in terms of, Kantian, I think a lot of the time people do try to argue against, particularly, say, the Kantian kind of approach by pointing to what behaviors you would get if people were to follow it rigidly, right? So they sort of use that as counterexample. Now, whether it's fair or not is another point, but I think that's a way of doing it. So I think in a way we sort of do versions of that as part of our arguments. We say, if you were to follow this properly, you would do this, blah blah blah. It tends to be hypothetical more than anything else. In terms of actually genuinely being an example, I mean, I tend to think that the way we would do philosophy is that we have this idea of the ad hominem fallacy. So it's like you would be wrong to criticize the person rather than their theories. So that therefore, if Peter Singer turns out to be a monster, which I don't believe he is, by the way, if hypothetically he's a monster, that wouldn't be an argument against utilitarianism, because you're confusing the person with the argument. And I think that's kind of true. But I think if Peter Singer turned out to be a monster because he was consistently applying his moral philosophy, then it would be an argument against it, right? So I think perhaps we should be we would better do a bit more attention to what it actually practically means to follow these things or not. But in a way, maybe we should also do it the other way around. But I think if we do it the other way around, I'll tell you what the other way around is in a minute, I think we might end up being a bit dispirited about philosophy. So to do it the other way around is forget philosophy. Let's look at the people who are moral exemplars, and then let's try and work out what makes them moral exemplars, and take that as the basis for our moral theory. And actually, I think that my view is that what you tend to find is that moral exemplars are people who actually have very little interest in moral theory and principle at all. They're just very good people in the sense that they have, they're very compassionate, they're very honest, they have great integrity. So some of these things you could articulate, it'd be interesting to theorize these things a bit more. What exactly does it mean to say they have integrity? What exactly does it mean to say they're compassionate?
Yeah, perhaps you need a theory in order to pick them in the first place. You need to have a theory already.
No, well, you wouldn't have to. No, I don't think you'd have to have a theory. You'd have to rather like in the case that with the Peter Singer paper that you have the strong intuition that this is the right thing to do. I think that we can all identify people we take to be morally exemplary without having a theory. I think in a sense, if you do philosophy for too long, you're going to lose sight of that. So you may or may not have been thinking this, Franco, but someone might think, well, look, if you're going to start by looking at moral exemplars, you need to have a theory of what being morally good means in order to identify who a moral exemplar is, right? So you've got to, for example, have the theory that the morally exemplary person is the one who considers the interests of everyone impartially in order to identify who is that best person. I actually would suggest that's not true. That's not true. That if you was to actually, go around a community, for example, and ask people systematically, who do you think are the most morally admirable people in this community? They would all agree without having any theoretical basis for that. And then you could do the analysis on that. So that'd be very, very different to what we do. And I think a lot of people wouldn't like it because it would blur the lines between descriptive psychology and anthropology and sociology and philosophy. But I'm all for blurring lines, so I don't mind about that. Anyway, grazie per la domanda.
Thank you very much.
Italian.
Thanks.
Thank you to Franco for his questions and to Julian for your response. So we have Ulrich requesting when we are providing links to books and to bookshops online, if we could provide alternatives to Amazon. He says he doesn't personally know anybody who doesn't want to buy from Amazon, but such people must exist. So he's expressing that as a moral dilemma. If we could just bear that in mind for the rest of the festival, if we're giving links, if there are any other links other than Amazon as well, that would be great. So we're not creating a monopoly. Right. Franco again says, how would you relate Jesus as a narrative device compared to Socrates and Plato?
As a narrative device, I've seen other. I mean, I don't know nothing against Franco, but I thought there are other questions from other people.
There are indeed. I was
just because we're going to run out of time at some point.
Indeed, we are. I'm just taking the questions in turn. I was okay.
Might be fair.
From Tonya.
Someone else's.
Okay, but we can come back to his the narrative device from Tonya. She says, thanks, it was very interesting. She was wondering what the theologian's response was to your project.
Yeah, no, that was interesting. Obviously, it's somewhat self-selecting. I didn't go and speak to fundamentalist Christians. It would have been a pointless enterprise. So the people I spoke to tended to be more that kind of, for want of a better word, liberal and way of thinking anyway, and more sort of ecumenical minded. But I think that overall, I think people welcomed, and actually it's interesting in terms of reviews, most of my reviews are from Christian press, actually. All the major Christian newspapers have reviewed it, whereas in terms of the mainstream media, the Guardian did, but not much else. I think people like the fact that it's taking Jesus seriously. They also like the idea that I'm presenting Jesus as a challenging rather than as a comforting figure. And I think that's kind of right. Where they would depart, and this is fine. I mean, they kind of say, if what I'm doing is fine. It's a thought experiment. It's not about what the historical Jesus thought or anything. It's just a thought experiment about what happens if you don't believe Jesus was the Son of God, and you try to save what's left from the Gospels. What happens? But I think most of them say that in the end, if you take away the Christ from Jesus, there's something too important has been taken away from that. And I think that the version that it comes back to, people give slightly different views, but I think the version is this, that what Jesus is asking us to do is very, very demanding. And it's actually something we can never fully succeed at. One of the most striking lines is be thee perfect, right? Be thee perfect. Now, he explicitly says we can't be perfect because at one point, someone says to him, good teacher, and he says, who are you calling good? No one is good but God, and he doesn't say he's God. So he's perfect. So we can't be perfect, but he asks us to be perfect. And that's part of the kind of the whole dynamic of the thing, that he thinks there's a great virtue in striving to do our best, knowing we can never fully succeed. And this goes back to we're fallen creatures, we're deeply imperfect. Now, the problem with that is that with the Christ and the resurrection, there is that divine aid to bridge the gap between how far we can go and how far we ought to go. And without the divine, we're kind of left in a state of helplessness. We have to know that we are fallen and we can't be saved. There is no redemption. And I think that the Christians, the believers, found that too bleak. As simple as that, too bleak. You need that divine assistance, or else, if the story ends on the cross, it's just a tragedy. It's just an awful thing. You need a resurrection, and I can see that. So I can see that in the sense that the moral teaching without the religious side is demanding, and yes, maybe somewhat bleak. But to me, that's realism. That's being realistic. I am an atheist, and I think if one's an atheist, one should legitimately talk about how life can still be good and valuable and worthwhile, but one shouldn't shy away from the fact that there's no guarantee of redemption, and that things can go wrong in ways that cannot be put right. Very, very hard to take. So it's a tough message.
Thank you. Okay, we have a question from Michael. He says, the first moves, which you say are the start of moral arguments, are not just appeals to institutions, for instance, the parables. They are imaginative ways of communicating or stimulating new insights. And he cites Iris Murdoch and Cora Diamond push a line like this. Any thoughts, comments on this?
Yeah, okay. No, I'm just going to take Michael's word for that. It's been, unfortunately, rather a long time since I read either of those people, and I've never read them in huge amounts. So I can see that. And it's an important distinction. In some ways, I could respond in one of two ways. One I could say is, well, in saying it evokes an intuition, that doesn't necessarily mean it's evoking something that was already kind of just there waiting to be pulled out. The intuition could be an intuition which is new to you. You could be surprised with your intuition. Let's put it that way, So in that sense, it might be that this is making us understand intuition more capaciously. But on the other hand, it can be useful to actually just distinguish them and say that, part of the value, and interesting you're talking about Iris Murdoch and Cora Diamond here. From what I can remember of both of those words, I think those people, I think that's why both of them, I think, would believe that there's, that the arts and fiction, for example, are valuable and important, potentially parts of moral learning and moral philosophy, because with fiction, for example, in literature, you can get that kind of imaginative insight, which can make you change your view of the world. I do believe that forms like fiction and film and theatre can do philosophy, can get you to see things. I've written about the films of the Cohen Brothers, actually, and I think the Cohen Brothers are really good for moral philosophy. Going back to what I was saying earlier about systems, what you kind of see in many of their, by the way, when you sum these things up, it's never as powerful as the showing is more powerful than the telling, and more important than the telling. But I think some of the sort of insights you get there is you get to see how actually, the fundamental differences between the good people and the bad people are, well, first of all, there are those psychopaths who basically just lack that basic moral sympathy, and they're irredeemable. So in their adaptation of No Country for Old Men, you've got someone who, because he lacks that fundamental capacity to empathize actually has his own rigid rules. In a sense, is more of a rigorous follower of rules than anyone, but that's lacking. So that tells you something important there. But then take away the people who are psychopaths, what you get are the people who basically give in to temptations, often by small steps. People are led to do awful things by small trails of temptation, and those who just simply almost just won't entertain it, just won't entertain it. There's something in them. And again, that's not theoretical. It's not because they have a moral commitment or a moral theory. So a long-winded way of saying good point, Michael.
Thank you. Okay, we have a point here from Eva. I'm not sure there's a question, but she's making a comment. That is the difficulty with classifying Jesus as a moral philosopher. Does it stem does it stem partially from the fact that he operated in a particular period and culture where wandering teachers provided sermons by parable and challenge, whereas this would be different from ancient Greece, where they were more scholarly? There was just a more scholarly tradition of philosophy.
Yeah, I think yes. I mean, I think that's kind of right, in the sense that what's happened is that the image of moral philosophy we have now has that lineage with the ancient Greek world, and so therefore we see the connection. So even though Plato's dialogues aren't exactly written in the form of modern papers, yeah, the connection's clear enough, and it's all about that. Whereas it just seems to be like a different tradition. I agree. Yeah. So yeah, it's just more difficult to locate. It's just more alien, isn't it? I think so.
Lovely. Okay. Now the next one is from Ed. He talks about modern memes. A big concern with evolutionary studies these days is the concept of memes and their fitness for survival. Your talk made me think that Jesus's methodology is part of what made his memes very sticky compared to, say, most moral philosophers. Do you have any thoughts about that, and whether that is a good way to characterize something to take from the example of Jesus?
Yeah, the stickiness of Jesus, it's a very, very interesting one, isn't it? I think actually I did write a chapter on this. There's a book published by edited by Tom Holland, Jesus the Revolutionary, or so it's called Revolutionary or something, and it's a series of essays on, what was it that meant this obscure person from Galilee was basically the initiator of a religion which is the world's largest by some margin. Actually, it's the world's largest religion by some margin. What was it? And I think, there's no single answer to that. A lot of it is to do with politics. I mean, what would have happened if Rome hadn't adopted Christianity as its official religion? We'll never kind of know. But I think that actually, say the methodology, I think it's partly the fact that there is so much kind of room for interpretation. There's a lot of contradiction, at least superficially, in Jesus. This is why even today, you can get people who are evangelical Christians who claim Jesus for conservative family values, even though Jesus had nothing positive at all to say about family, and in fact told people that they would divide their families and they should leave their families. And in the early part of the story, somebody says, I'll come and follow you, Jesus, but I've just got to bury my father first. And he goes, no, let the dead bury the dead. That's where that phrase comes from. Come and follow me. It didn't even think people should prioritize the burying of their own parents as important compared to pursuing the good. So I think he has this capacity to be remade in so many different ways, and you see it every single way. So I mean, he teaches about poverty and blessed are the poor, and yet still you got this nonsense of the prosperity gospel in North America. Yeah, and the point is, if it were just simply the case that he was absolutely explicit and clear about everything, this wouldn't be possible. It's because there's a kind of the methodology, as you put it, it requires us to bring our interpretative edge in there. And that means he's been able to be remade and refashioned in so many different ways. So to use the meme gene metaphor, it's highly replicable, and it mutates very easily. And when that happens, it's, as we know, even random mutation will generate new variants that are very sticky. Sorry to remind us of why we're doing this online, but
thank you. Okay, thank you. So John is thanking you for an earlier answer that you gave. He says, great answer. And the next point, he's talking about truth-seeking versus way-seeking. He says, at what point and why did the West turn more to truth-seeking over way-seeking, do you think? Do you think Western thinkers might start turning back to way-seeking as we become, particularly since Nietzsche, etc., more skeptical about truth? And truth is with a capital T, because that's the way you're referring to it, right?
Yeah, I mean, I wouldn't claim to have enough historical credentials to answer this properly, really. I mean, I think there are possibly lots of, rather than sort of trying to give a date, I mean, you give some of the reasons. I think in Plato already, you kind of have, I think the Platonic Christian sort of marriage, I think, was so important for the development of Western culture. I mean, it was when Plato was kind of added to Christianity that the idea of the immortal soul, for example, you don't see it in the Gospels. And it seemed very clear early Christians believed that resurrection was of the flesh, or the body, it needed to be. So you get that kind of Christian Platonic. And the thing about Plato is Plato, with his theory of forms and everything, I know there's a lot of room for interpretive disagreement here, but it really did sort of create that idea of truth as an absolute, as something that could be found and could be penetrated, and that was the basis of his system. The form of the good, which is an abstract truth, a sort of eternal truth, was what everything sort of led towards. So it probably has its roots back in that. The exact trajectory, I don't know. But in terms of working its way back, but it is in the sense already. And I don't think it's to do with skepticism about truth with a capital T, actually. I kind of think, in a way, we've gone past the zenith of that kind of stuff. I think most people now think, even a lot of the people who were branded with this post-modern label now recognize that things went too far. There's a very interesting article, I think, with Bruno Latour. So Bruno Latour was very famously parodied by Alan Sokal. And again, he wouldn't characterize himself as a postmodernist. That's a different thing. But it was social. What's the term? Anyway, but very much the idea of that science is just socially produced, no ultimate knowledge, and like a lot of people, he kind of wrote this almost mea culpa, where he recognized the fact that when they were writing that stuff, it was meant to be about challenging power, and they really didn't recognize that it actually was playing into the hands of people like the neoconservatives and Trumps, who sort of took the idea of there being no absolute truth as a gift. It meant that they didn't have to answer to anything other than their own ideology. So I don't think it's the decline of belief in truth with a capital T. I think it's just more of a recognition that what motivates, why are people doing this? That there is some people are just interested in the puzzles for their own sake. But most people aren't. Most people, and it was quite interesting. Quite a few years ago now, in the early days of the Philosopher's magazine, Jeremy Stangram, who I started the magazine with, and I did a book of interviews with what were then young British philosophers, and many of them are now the grandees of the subject. And when we asked them about, how did you get started in philosophy, we asked them all of that. Most of these people, they got started in philosophy because they were into the big questions, and then they get that knocked out of them and find that philosophy is still interesting. I think a lot of people now are just not accepting the fact that, okay, it gets beaten out of you, but perhaps it shouldn't be, actually. That's what got them there in the first place.
Indeed. Thank you. We've got a few more minutes left before we take a break. We've got loads of questions, so we won't be able to take all of them. Would you like me to read 2 or 3 questions to you, or would you like me to take them one at a time so that you can decide?
Maybe. I think the main thing, though, is I mean, you're the organisers, but I think it's really, I want to be fair to the next speaker and make sure that
Of course, absolutely, we will be.
We don't eat into their time, and we give people a chance for a break, so that
absolutely,
when the next speaker starts, people haven't gone off to the loo. So I think.
Would you like to take one more?
Let's do that. Let's do one more.
Right, one more. In that case, the final one from Jacob. What is the main difference between Jesus's approach to moral philosophy, which you characterize as anti-systematic, with later Christian attempts to systematize moral philosophy? For instance, Thomism, or situation ethics? Is there a major break between the two traditions for you?
That is an interesting question, and I think yes, but it's just one of many examples of how Christ's teachings, as given to us in the Gospels, so often resulted in things which are the polar opposites. I mean, so take some of the things which are unequivocal. Jesus has no time at all for clerical structures, hierarchies, and so forth. He says something like, "None of you shall be rabbis," or something, And what happens? The movement that takes his name ends up with even more arcane layers of clerisy than even are there in the Judaism of his day. Similarly, he was anti-doctrinal, essentially. He said that he was there to uphold the law, but his point was this: that the law exists for a purpose, and what's primary is the purpose, not the law. So the tail is wagging the dog when you follow the letter of the law, if that actually is going against what it is the law is supposed to be achieving, right? So very much goes, and of course, and again, what happens? The centuries of Christianity in which people were burnt at the stake for heresy over. So many times he has gone the other way, and you're right. The systematization of the moral systems, Thomism, all that kind of thing, it's not in the spirit of the original. Let's put it that way. Yeah.
I think I've been told by the host we have time for one more question. Because we can go until 25 past. I'll take a final question from Michael, who says, Christ was a social critic and satirist. He spoke in parables. If he was not engaged in academic argument, he was involved in a disruptive social movement. The context gives coherence to what otherwise might be just anecdotes. Would you agree? Any comments?
Let me see. So he's involved in sort of social movement. Well, he was involved in a disruptive social movement of a kind, although it's not clear what that was. I mean, not time to go into it now, but I think it's very clear he wasn't trying to bring about political change. Actually, he refused to lead a revolutionary movement. Time and again, it made him unpopular. People wanted him to do that. I think he thought the revolution is to recognize the fact that you need to work on your own goodness, and you need to forget about all this other stuff. And the world, even the political structures, wealth, power, family, all these things are absolutely secondary. You got to work on your own self, and that's the real challenging thing. So that you say the context gives a coherence to either way anecdotes. Yes, I mean, the context gives a coherence in the sense that the context gives you a picture of what it was he was rebelling against. These ideas were coming in as a challenge to a certain way of doing things, and that does give it a coherence. I think that's true, but I think it also has a coherence in the sense that the dots can be joined for yourself, right? So in the same way, if you just pick up Confucius Analects for the first time and start flicking through it, you might think that, well, this is just a series of disconnected sayings, isn't it? But when you look at them all together, you see how they do connect. So I think they also connect by kind of internal logic as well as by the historical context.
Thank you so much for your comprehensive responses and for allowing so much time for the Q&A, and for really trying to get us to think this way about truth-seeking versus way seeking and the role of Jesus within that, and where philosophy is going. Where was it? Where is it going? We're doing a bit of time travel as well. Thank you so much. Really very much appreciated.